Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Kate Rigby. Kate, thanks so much for making time for us.
The pleasure.
Yeah, really, the pleasure is all mine. You do so many great things in the world of environmental humanities. For folks that don't know you, you're the Alexander von Humboldt Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Cologne. And you have a lot of great books out on environmental humanities and ecocriticism. And most recently, a really exciting project, Meditations on Creation in an Era of Extinction. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about that and your work in general. And to begin, I always like hearing people's origin story. Like, how did you get into this work? Especially because it's not always an easy and obvious connection for people to bridge the world of environmental issues and the humanities. A lot of people think environmental work is going to be activism or policy or science, and the humanities has nothing to do with it. You're just confusing everybody. And likewise, if you get into the humanities, there's all kinds of things to do that aren't environmental. So how did you get into that intersection?
Well, I guess it was kind of there for me from the start. That is to say, certainly during my postgraduate studies, I was very much engaged with reflecting on the ways in which our sort of cultural assumptions, our ways of thinking, our ways of speaking, our sense of what it meant to be human and how we should relate to others, was informing our relationship with non-human others and our shared environs. So I got interested, I suppose, in ecological thought already as a master's student back in the 1980s. At the University of Melbourne, very much in conversation with my friends, including the person who became my husband, who was developing a kind of eco-philosophical take on postmodernist thought back in the day then. So I was very much concerned with this question of sort of culture and ecology, particularly seen through philosophical reflection, and also literary texts as well. When I was a bachelor's student at the University of Melbourne doing German studies, I read Nietzsche, and our lecturer was particularly interested in Nietzsche's natural imagery and view of nature. And I took to heart his exhortation, sei die Erde treu, be true to the earth. That became my clarion cry. So I guess I was kind of interested in this, all along. But actually, when I finished my doctorate, I didn't really see a great deal of opportunity to advance my very urgent ecological concerns within academia as a humanities scholar at that time. So I really wanted to kind of become a Greenpeace warrior or to really get involved in activism. But hey, I needed a job. And I wasn't sure what Greenpeace would do with somebody who just finished their doctorate in German literature and thought from the Goethe period. And there's a lectureship going, so I took it up and kind of got stuck in academia. But the great thing, I think, for me was really getting to know people who were further advanced than I was in eco-philosophy, in ecology and religion, environmental anthropology, environmental history, and indeed eco-criticism, and realizing that that I could really bring my passions together, my love of learning, my love of literature and philosophy and religious thought. I could bring those together with my sort of ecological passions.
That's great. Yeah. And, one of the things I really appreciate about your work also is that a lot of people, when they address, literature from around the Goethe period, Nietzsche and stuff like, you're either going to pick the German work or you're going to focus on English literature. And you really integrate those a lot. And to me, that's very refreshing. And especially, I mean, along with religious, philosophical, literary, you just have such a capacious perspective on things. So it's always just a pleasure to read your work. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, Romanticism writ large. And
Mhm.
because, of course, you have this wonderful book that was from 2020, Reclaiming Romanticism Towards an Eco-Poetics of Decolonization. And it's a really wonderful text. And reclaiming romanticism is almost like an insult. People say, "Oh, you're romanticizing. You're romanticizing," and you're like, "Hold on a second. There's another way to read romanticism that's much more engaging and so relevant to our current time."
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I guess there have been sort of various waves in the eco-critical engagement with Romanticism. The first was turning to Romanticism as a kind of road not taken, and as a kind of alternative to forms of instrumental rationality and so on. And then there was a kind of period of kind of critical engagement and recognizing that that some of the things that are problematic in sort of later 19th and 20th century conservation, particularly the ideas of preservation of wilderness and so on, which have historically went hand in hand with forms of colonization, exclusion of First Nations from their land, misrecognition of the way, or failure to recognize the way in which First Peoples had actually contributed to the ecological kind of diversity of those places. And I guess my own earlier book on Romanticism was kind of had a kind of ambivalent take on Romanticism. So I also kind of participated to some extent in that kind of critical moment. But then, as you said, I became increasingly frustrated, along with other scholars of particularly European Romanticism, with what had become a kind of reductive rejection of Romanticism, often not very well informed, and frequently shaped by later developments, really settler colonial variants of Romanticism, such as that kind of wilderness preservation moment. And therefore was overlooking the really valuable points of departure for contemporary ecological thought that can actually be found within European Romanticism around 1800. And so what I tried to do in the more recent book really was to just draw out some of those strands, and trying to avoid speaking of Romanticism per se, because I just see it as an incredibly complex and contradictory phenomenon. It's not a single thing, and it definitely changes when it crosses the Atlantic to North America. It's also different in Australia. Romanticism doesn't really come to Australia until the late 19th century.
Mm.
And it's different there again. And within, even the sort of German and British high point of Romanticism around 1800, there are all kinds of different things going on there. So I'm not talking about Romanticism as a whole. What I'm just doing is trying to sort of pinpoint specific dimensions that I think can usefully be brought into conversation with contemporary concerns, not necessarily or indeed not at all trying to sort of map some linear connection, but really to open up a space for conversation. Yeah.
And I think to me, one of the things that was really surprising there, because like you say, there's the settler colonial side of Romanticism, and then you're actually looking at a decolonial side of it. And I think that's one of those things people are not going to expect, to find in Romanticism. And it's such a great part of your work, and so important right now for the environmental humanities to engage with. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about the decolonial dimension of your work in that text, but also in general, because I know you've done work even more recently. There was a conference, and so you're really, engaging the humanities in the project of decolonization.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is a complex phenomenon, and of course, I come to it as an inheritor of settler colonial culture in Australia. You know, I'm a white Australian of largely Celtic and a little bit of English background, but certainly, you know, I know within my own family background, a few generations back, that my forebears were complicit with land theft in Australia. And decolonization, I think, is at its heart to do with land. It's to do with land theft, land restitution, but also to do with the way in which people relate to land and how it's viewed. And it has, therefore, an ontological and ethical dimension as well as a political dimension. And in the Romanticism book, I'm, I guess, particularly concerned with those ontological and ethical aspects of decolonization, in which I also consider forms of domination that are akin to and entangled with colonization beyond the human. So I look at structures, ways of thinking about human identity in which human corporeality is subordinated to human intellect. I look at relations between humans and non-human others that also have this kind of hegemonic structure. I look at the ways in which those forms of hegemony, mind, body, matter, reason, nature, reason, human, non-human, how those are challenged within particular romantic texts. Then I also look, however, at the way that within settler colonial culture, certain romantic notions become entangled with colonization. So I'm trying to do a sort of nuanced, make a nuanced argument about Romanticism as having decolonial affordances, but also as requiring a kind of decolonial critique at the same time. And in order to effect that, I turn to the kind of colonial context that I know best, which is Australia, and engage in conversation with Indigenous scholars and writers in Australia. And it's really their voices that I bring into play there to open up that kind of decolonial take on Romanticism itself.
Nice. That's very helpful. I think people are hearing a lot about decolonization. It's become somewhat of a buzzword in academia, and important to hear some of the nuance and well, here's actually how we're engaging with these issues and the ontological and ethical implications of them. And of course, thinking in the Australian context, I can't help but think of the great ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood, who I know you engage her work and her critique of the logic of colonization. And so important to me. She's just one of my favorite philosophers, and I think she has such an enduring legacy. And I'm not sure if North America appreciates her as much as Australia does. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to her enduring legacy, because she's so crucial for so many great Australian thinkers and thinkers around the world.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, she was also a dear friend of mine, I should say. So I don't have an unbiased view. In fact, I'm one of her literary, or what do you call it, executors. And also part of the trust that basically inherited her home and her land, which we've actually returned the land to New South. Well, we've given the land to most of the land to New South Wales National Parks, and also very much in close conversation now with local Aboriginal people about its management, and indeed about Val's legacy. She was, I think, really one of, if not the first, really deeply intersectional thinkers. I mean, that book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, from 1996, I think it was a really concerted attempt to bring together post-colonial thought, socialist thought, Marxist and post-Marxist thought, feminist thought, and deep ecology or radical ecology. So the critique of the domination of nature, and it's really all those kind of distinct forms of hegemony she sees as being historically but also logically interconnected, or perhaps one should say historically interconnected and logically analogous, I could say the first way to put it, and her critique of the logic of colonization. But it really is informed by post-colonial thought, feminist thought, socialist thought, and radical ecology. And I think she's not alone. Other thinkers in the sort of Australian ecological thought arena, like Freya Matthews, for example, the environmental philosopher Freya Matthews, and also the environmental anthropologist and ecocultural theorist Deborah Bird-Rose, were very influential in averting the kind of standoff that you got, I think, in the States between people who are primarily concerned with questions of social justice and affiliated with social ecology, and those who are concerned with just relations between humans and non-human others, and with questions of biodiversity conservation and so on, who were kind of more affiliated with deep ecology. We didn't really have that divide as strongly in Australia. I think there was an early and clear sense that questions of social justice, including post-colonial questions and decolonial aspirations, had to be combined with ecological questions and ethical questions about our relations with non-human others. And so in various ways, Australian thinkers in what became the environmental humanities, we called it the ecological humanities in the late 90s, but what became the environmental humanities have really sought to understand those interconnections. And I think maybe that's a sort of distinctive aspect there. And there are, I think, historical reasons for that. It wasn't just the happenstance of particular thinkers. The environmental movement emerged in Australia at exactly the same time as the Aboriginal land rights movement. Conservationists in Australia, environmentalists, were told off pretty quickly by Aboriginal people for using this term wilderness.
Right.
And for example, another really influential person was the writer Judith Wright, whom I discuss in Reclaiming Romanticism. who was the founder of the first kind of conservation movement in Australia, and the first conservation organisation, a co-founder of the Australian Conservation Foundation, which grew out of a prior struggle. But she was also very much involved with Aboriginal land rights and had close relations with Aboriginal people, and particularly the Aboriginal author Ujuru Nanakal. And she basically told her comrades in the Australian Conservation Foundation right from the start, look, you can't talk about wilderness. You know, there is no wilderness on this continent. Every square inch of Australia was, you know, had been shaped, tended, and sustained by Aboriginal people, you know, for millennia, you know. So I think, so you do see the term wilderness being used, but it's usually carefully qualified. It's not untouched by human hand. It's basically, it might be used to refer to country that's not been significantly transformed by agriculture or industry, but where Aboriginal land management is acknowledged. And indeed, some of the like big national parks, like Kakadu National Park, is under Aboriginal management. So it's, you know, historically there are some significant differences which I think informed the Australian environmental humanities in quite interesting ways.
Yeah, that's that's fascinating, and something I think that folks in the United States could learn a lot from, because it's that standoff is really still there, and even though it's gradually kind of percolating into academia, but it's still very much in our institutions and our laws. And I mean, the Wilderness Act in the United States defines wilderness as untrammeled land, untouched by humans. I'm like, okay,
Absolutely.
it's gonna take a lot of work to kind of undo that misunderstanding. And we'll see. We're getting there slowly but surely. You know, you mentioned how people used to call environmental humanities ecological humanities. I still kind of prefer that. I like that. Do you think there's a chance we could bring that back, or is environmental humanities so entrenched now that we should just go with that?
Oh, look, I have asked myself that question. So we, as I say, it was actually Deborah Bird. Well, actually, it was the historian Tom Griffiths, environmental historian Tom Griffiths, and Tim Berney-Hady, who is actually an environmental lawyer and an art historian. They came up with the coinage ecological humanities in around 1998. And then Debbie Rose and environmental historian and historian of science Libby Robin called together the National Working Group for the Ecological Humanities. Our first meeting was, I think, 1999. And this is the term we went for. We created what we called an ecological humanities corner in an open access journal, the Australian Humanities Review. And so you can see that's an archive of the early Australian ecological humanities. We had a manifesto for the ecological humanities, which you can still find online. But then when Debbie and Tom van Duren and others founded the Environmental Humanities Journal in 2012, they decided to go with that term, which was the term that had taken off in the States. And it has, I suppose, the advantage that when you refer to ecology, people might not think of the built environment. And so I think environmental humanities was considered to be more inclusive by its advocates. As it happened, I was among those who preferred ecological humanities because it keeps ecology in view. And well, it keeps it sort of central that we are, concerned with obviously with the nexus of various forms of kind of social injustice, but also more than human justice in the context of a really grave moment of global ecological unraveling.
Yeah.
So I prefer ecological humanities, but I do think that environmental humanities has now gone global and it's becoming so well established, and you don't want to risk kind of just when things like in Germany, it's just really beginning to take off. There are now 2 chairs of environmental humanities in Germany, my own and one at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität, the Munich University. Groups are kind of forming to develop programs and so on, but it's really just emerging, and to sort of then say, oh, we should be talking about ecological humanities instead, might sort of undermine the effort to kind of to get this going. So I'm content to go with it.
That's good. It's good to know, because sometimes I feel like pushing back a little, like, no, ecological. There was something there that was pretty special. That's a good point though about the built environment. I mean, you could always say, well, but ecology includes urban ecologies and things like that. So yeah, but that is a good point. I'm curious, what's the German word then for it?
Okay, well, you could say ökologische Geisteswissenschaften, that would be ecological humanities, but people don't. In general, people are using environmental humanities. Germans and German is very inclusive of loan words from other languages. And my own research group is slightly different, mainly to get the acronym, which we really love, MESH, Multidisciplinary Environmental Studies in the Humanities. And one can translate that into German. Also multidisziplinäre Umweltstudien in den Geisteswissenschaften. Or you could say geisteswissenschaftliche Umweltstudien. You can say that. That would be environmental humanities, studies of the humanities, or human sciences. So the German phrase for humanities expression is, of course, human sciences. Right. Oh no, in fact, it's not. It's not. No, it's Geisteswissenschaften, right. Sciences of the mind. Yeah. So Michel Serres and Bruno Latour talk about the modern constitution of knowledge, separating the natural sciences from the human sciences. In German, the distinction is even more kind of telling, because the implication is that only humans have mind or spirit, and that nature, by implication, is mindless. It's very much that German coinage is really, I think, testimony to Val Plumwood's critique that really at the base of these kind of nexus of dualisms is mind nature. And that what has historically been elevated in the human is the mind. Yeah. So yeah, it's very striking. Yeah. That's so one wouldn't even, in a sense, want to be. I prefer environmental humanities because at least it doesn't have that idea that dealing with the things of human culture is dealing with things of the mind, somehow separate from nature.
No, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that. Is at least if you have a human nature dualism, you're leaving open the question of whether nature has mind in it. Exactly. But when you have the mind nature dualism, you're really saying, yeah, there's mindless nature out there with no awareness, no sentience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, that's good. Yeah, I really appreciate your, international perspective on these things. It's so important to think globally, and of course, people have been saying that for a long time. Think globally, act locally, and all that. But I think it's still a challenge to open up that perspective. Um, well, geez, we got to talk about the new book, Meditations on Creation in an Era of Extinction. I was so excited to see this when it was coming out, and when it came out very recently. So I still haven't had a chance to read it, but such a great topic. And what's this genre that you're working in? The hexameron?
Correct. Actually, that's right. So that's the Greek term. It was originally used to refer to the creation narrative in Genesis 1, because hexa is six, and emera is work. So it's it's days. So it's the 6 days. Hexameron refers to the 6 days of creation, which is Genesis 1 in the Christian Bible. But then it started being used for this ancient but largely forgotten genre of Christian literature, which are meditations on that biblical narrative. And the first person to actually use it that way was Basil of Caesarea in the 4th century, one of the Eastern Church Fathers, who gave a series of homilies during Easter week. 1 year, and these were published. He published them under the title Hexameron. And so this started what became known as the hexameral tradition. So there were precursors for this. The first was actually by the classically trained Jewish scholar, Philo. And this was hugely influential on the Christian commentators who came afterwards. They included Origen, for example, before Basil. It really kind of, I suppose, reached its kind of first flowering in the 4th century. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire, it comes back really only in the medieval period. Bede is one of the first. Bede has a hexameron. There's an early Anglo-Saxon hexameron by a guy called Elfric. And then a number of famous dudes from later in the medieval period, like Abelard, for example, as in Abelard and Eloise. In fact, Eloise and her nuns asked Abelard to explain the hexameron to them, to explain Genesis 1 to them. And he said, well, you placed me in a really difficult position because this is the most mysterious text in the Bible, and I'm bound to make a fool of myself, but I'm going to have a go. And most of them say, as he does, well, I'm not sure what this means, and I'm not sure what that means, but perhaps it means this, perhaps it means that. Super interesting tradition. So, and then it goes through other sort of famous people who engage in this genre are Robert Grosseteste, Bonaventure. So we're looking sort of 12th, 13th century. It has a kind of new flowering. And then it pretty much peters out. It kind of goes into literature. There are literary variants of it. And I discuss Milton. Milton smuggles an hexameron into Paradise Lost.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because Adam says at one point, well, what's the story? How did I get to be here? What's the backstory to this whole situation I'm in now? And so the Archangel Gabriel does a hexameron, does a meditation on the 6 days of creation in his tradition, in, of course, glorious Miltonic verse. It's really stunning. And then also in the 17th century, there's a prose version, as far as I've been able to find. It's really the last hexameron, certainly in sort of the English tradition, and actually the first in English, well, apart from Milton's verse version, and that's by Thomas Traherne in the 17th century. So it peters out basically with the scientific revolution, so I tried to pick it up and revivify it, but I'm not the only one, because I had been thinking about writing this book for years, and I was just beginning to kind of research it and get going on it when I noticed that the Archbishop of Canterbury had recommended a book for Lenten meditations for people in the Church of England, Episcopalian Church in America.
Right.
And this book is by Ruth Valerio, and it's called Saying Yes to Life. So I thought, oh, I must get that. This is, Archbishop's recommendation. I have a look at that. And what do I find? This book is this remarkable, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, really written for church groups to use as an aid to sort of reflection in the lead up to Easter, in the Lenten period. It has the form of, it's structured around the 6 days of creation, or indeed the 7 days of creation, because quite rightly, she includes the all-important seventh day that gets hived off into Genesis 2 in the Christian Bible, but is all, of course, part of the one narrative in the Hebrew, Bereshit.
Right.
It's all part of the one. It's only in the Christian Bible that gets, the seventh day gets kind of separated off and left out, which is, I think, a huge problem. So anyway, so Ruth Valerio had written an hexameron. So initially I thought, oh no. Well, I'll have to write something else instead. And then I thought, well, no, in the 4th century, a whole lot of people wrote hexamera. In the 12th century, a whole lot of people wrote hexamera. I can also write hexamera. In the 21st century, it will hopefully be one of many. Right. What Ruth doesn't do, and it perhaps wouldn't be appropriate in the kind of book she was writing, she doesn't reference the earlier tradition at all. But so one of the things that's a bit different in mine is that I engage in a conversation lightly with those earlier hexameral writers. I refer to their some of the ways in which they interpret and reflect upon each of the days. And I suppose the other thing that's a bit different is that there's much more of my own voice in there. I think Ruth, I think, holds back a bit. I again, as is appropriate for the kind of book she is writing, but I'm probably much more forthcoming with respect to my own ethical political stance on things. And I'm also more, it's more autobiographical. I kind of thread sort of lyrical reflections and autobiographical kind of narratives through there. It's a very different book from any of my previous books, and I do hope that it will be read by people who are not academics. That was my aspiration, was really to get out of the academic enclave and write a book that would appeal to non-academic readers.
Yeah, that's so important, especially when you're talking about an era of extinction. This can't just be something that academics are talking about. This is, relevant to every living being on the planet. So yeah, I appreciate that, and that you include the seventh day in the afterword. So you sneak that in there. It is so strange to me to think of the 6 days and just end it there without thinking of that seventh day.
Yeah, and actually it leads to a huge and catastrophic distortion, because if you leave out the seventh day, you get the impression that the whole thing culminates with the making of human beings.
Right.
But it doesn't. It doesn't. It culminates with the day of rest, the day of celebration, Philo Philo, being a Jewish, of course, as the Jewish commentator, it's all part of the one story for him. It's the Christian commentators that leave off the seventh day because they've got their Bible where it's Genesis 1, you see. But for Philo, he says, it is the festival of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a festival of the universe where you celebrate the whole of creation in an incredible abundance and diversity and wonder. And that's what it culminates with.
That's a huge difference, and that's such a criticism so frequently leveled against Abrahamic traditions is they're so anthropocentric, and it's like, oh no, not at all. That's a terrible misreading.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. I mean, it's very interesting that you can really see the difference between the Christian emphasis because of the way the editors of the Bible cut that narrative from the Jewish commentators. But then also it has to be said that despite that, what really drew me in as I started reading more into this was the way that that it was a vehicle for the celebration precisely of the abundance and diversity of life on Earth. It's about Earth, and it's about Earth as a more than human collective, and yet at the same time, I keep on stumbling over moments in some of the commentators more than others, where when it comes to the making of human beings, you get quite stark statements of human supremacy. So it's really quite sort of distressing to encounter that. My notes, I handwrite my notes still, and where I'm kind of transcribing passages or praising passages that of this kind, I write in the margins, yuck. Like this. So I'm kind of struggling with it, but on the other hand, that delight and wonder about more than human life is a dimension of the Christian tradition that also has been largely forgotten, and as I say, they vary. Basil in particular is absolutely beside himself and breathless with enthusiasm. He keeps on saying, oh, my words are running away from me, or I cannot hope to express how wonderful plants are, or what can I select to talk about? It's all so amazing. And also there's this emphasis on the participation of Earth, of the land, and of the waters in the generation of living beings.
Right.
That they're seen as, in fact, it's Traherne talks of Earth and sea collaborating with the Creator, or cooperating with the Creator in the bringing forth of these things. And there's also a big emphasis on the incredible intelligence and virtues of heaps of different creatures. Basil talks about how even fish are actually more reasonable in their way of life than humans. And Ambrose, who wrote the first Latin hexameron, very strongly modeled on Basil's, talks about the way that humans actually stumble because of their propensity to overvalue their own world of thought,
Right.
and they're actually a lot less sensible because they get misled by what we would today call ideologies, basically.
Right.
And also, you know, how they're much more violent and in the sense of, obviously predation is recognized, that some, you know, animals eat other animals, but human kind of land grabs and wars of conquest and so on are criticized as evidence that of the moral superiority of other creatures, you know, in certain respects.
Yeah, that's a great
Yeah,
point. Yeah, in a lot of
yeah.
ways, humans are a little messed up compared to other
Yeah,
creatures.
exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, and to see these church fathers come out and say that. And also, you know, Augustine, depending on whether you're Protestant or Catholic, um, he's very forthright also about continuities between humans and other animals. You know, he says of the creatures of day 6, he said, well, we're all animals. Yeah, says, you know, the Bible talks of humans as animals, and you know, or as amongst the land creatures. We are, of course, all animals. So you know, and also all but plants as well as animals are understood to be ensouled. All living creatures have souls.
Right.
You know, this was generally accepted. So, you know, the idea that you know, that the church fathers or whatever thought that only humans had souls is just frankly wrong. So again, I suppose it's a bit like, you know, with Romanticism. I'm also trying to, I seem to have stumbled upon a strand of Christian literature that helps us to get a more nuanced and fuller understanding of what the Christian tradition actually holds. And I hope that will be encouraging for contemporary Christians who have who may or may not have environmental concerns, but to understand that within their tradition there is an honoring of more than human life, and also no suggestion, even though you know, we may be considered sort of uniquely in the image and likeness of God, which is usually attributed to our faculty of reason. That doesn't mean that we should exploit or disrespect non-human others.
Right.
They're absolutely upfront about that as well. So that distinction doesn't mean, and this, you know, the term that gets translated as dominion, none of these hexameral writers interpret that to mean that we are licensed to do what we like, you
Yeah.
know, with the earth, or treat other creatures as we wish, you know,
Yeah,
because
right.
they are all good in and of themselves.
Yeah, not just objects to be used by instrumental reason.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Dominion doesn't mean domination.
No, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like the idea that nature is participating in all these creative acts as well, which seems so obvious when you just read the text. Because in
Yeah.
the beginning, there's already wind hovering over the face of the deep, so it's like there's air, there's water, it's
Exactly.
already there in the mix. So
Absolutely.
strange to think God is doing this just all by himself without
Yeah.
any participation from the natural world.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I wonder, do you talk at all about the difference between Genesis 1 and 2 in terms of the creation of humans? Because one of the unique things about Genesis 1 is man and woman are created together, whereas in Genesis 2 you have the whole Adam is there first, and Eve is made out of Adam, so you get kind of the subordination of women to men kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't go on and reflect upon that myself. I restrict myself very much to this poem, this, you know, really philosophical poem, if you like,
Mm.
of the 7 days, which obviously has probably mythic origins, but so I just restrict myself to that, except that sometimes you can see that the interpretation of Genesis 1 by the hexameral commentators is informed by their reading of Genesis
Mhm.
2. And so I kind of I comment on that from time to time, but I leave that aside. It's such a different story, and
Right.
I just wanted to spend my time with that narrative.
Yeah, that's one of the really cool parts of that genre of writing is to really just focus on those 7 days. And
Yeah.
because otherwise, yeah, once you start referring to other chapters of Genesis or other books of the Bible, then that's just a whole other thing at that point.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah, but again, some of the commentators do bring in other texts as well, and so I comment on that as well, and particularly key ones that actually there are, even though dominion is not domination, but even still it is a hierarchical relationship that is
Right.
established there. But even that potentially non-exploitative relationship is really challenged by other texts. Like Job, for
Mm.
example, where you have the Leviathan celebrated precisely for its resistance to human
Right.
dominion. It's very much challenged. And also, the other thing that I also note is that that the concept of kingship
Mm.
that is implicit in Genesis 1, 26, 28, is a Hebraic concept of kingship,
Mm.
within which the role of the king is to be as a brother to
Mm.
his subjects. And so you can see that very clearly in Philo, where he talks about the human role being that of care for plants and animals. The English translation of his term there is, yes, care for plants.
Mm.
The other thing that I do in the book, and that made it so much fun and so rewarding to research and write, is that I include the voices of others, people who are doing wonderful work in environmental climate activism and
Mm.
conservation, from sort of faith-informed perspective, largely Christian, but also one interfaith organization, where I also do interview the rabbi who co-founded or who founded actually Green Faith Australia.
Mm.
And so that in sort of trying to revivify this tradition, I have at the back of my mind the structure of a homily or a sermon, given that that many of these earlier texts were actually delivered as homilies.
Mm.
And so I begin with a kind of personal narrative, and then I look at the text. I consider the interpretations of those who've gone before, and I suggest my own line of reading, and in conversation with contemporary sources of knowledge, from the natural sciences, but also from indigenous knowledges. And this too is what the hexameral tradition does. So it was in conversation. These earlier meditations were always in conversation with the natural philosophy of the day. So I do that, and then I kind of move to what you might call prophetic critique. So looking at the kind of relevant aspect of creation, earthly creation, that is in dire straits at present, and look at the causes for that. But then I want to end always with words of encouragement. And I couldn't summon them just from within myself. I thought the best way to give words of encouragement was to bring examples of what other people were doing,
Oh, that's nice.
to respond to, what the Pope calls the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So what are folks actually doing? Here are some really good examples of what folks are doing. Ruth Valerio does that in Saying Yes to Life as well. So I did a series of interviews with people. And I also chose initiatives in different parts of the world. So I think all of the or most of the continents of the earth are kind of represented there, and also different traditions. And I bring in a sense their work, their testimony to bear, and that was just really inspiring for me to do that research, to have those conversations, and I hope it will be encouraging for readers as well, and give some ideas for things that folks can do together as well.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I like the idea of bringing some prophetic critique while also showing all the great work that's happening, because it really is remarkable. Even though things are getting worse in so many respects, things are also getting better at the same time, and it's really hopeful to see that, especially when you're looking at it across multiple continents. Look how many things are already happening, and these are things we can all join in with, participate in, and be part of this a more creative relationship to our planet. So yeah, that's really quite a gift. Well, I wonder, speaking of the words of encouragement, if you can kind of give us one of those words, maybe one example of one of the projects that you were engaging with, one of the people you were interviewing, and because I always like to end on a hopeful note.
Well, I will reference one that is very much at the front of my mind at the moment, because we have at MESH an online public lecture, but it's actually a public discussion coming up next week with two people, one of whom is one of the people whom I interviewed for the book, and she is called Queen Elizabeth Hare. Elizabeth is her middle name, Queen Elizabeth Hare, and she comes from Kenya. And at the time that I interviewed her, she was working for a Russia, Kenya, in their marine conservation initiative. So there is a big marine national park in Kenya called the Watamu Marine National Park. And it was actually a Russia, Kenya that employed a marine biologist to evaluate this area of coastal oceans, and to develop a program for marine conservation there. So Russia is an international Christian conservation organization, and it's based in the UK but has an international reach. And so I interviewed the wonderful American marine biologist, who is also a very devout Christian, Bob Sluka, who really, as I say, did the first evaluations of that marine national park and developed the conservation program. And he introduced me to Queen, who had been employed as an education officer. She was working with kids to introduce them to the wonders of those waters, and to involve them in practical things like plastics, kind of beach clearing and so on. She was also working with women's groups, and also with fishermen, because this is an area where there's always been subsistence fishing. And it was during, so the interview was in 2020, and then I did a follow-up interview, actually 2021, or even no, 2022, it was just last year. So it was during the Corona period, and it was the ability to kind of get fish for the family was really important for these people who may not have been able to get income from their other jobs. So, as in many parts of Africa, there potentially a conflict between human subsistence and conservation. And she was doing, I think, really, really important work with local fishermen, introducing them to sustainable fishing, explaining the importance of marine conservation, but also she comes from that community and she understands, you know, their subsistence requirements as well. So really, really wonderful work. But I think one of the things that really struck me in my conversation with Bob as well was that there are particular affordances from within religious traditions for approaching conservation in a non-instrumental way. Because if you look at sort of conservation policies, they generally presuppose that it's about sustaining what are essentially resources for human use. Right. So the whole foundation of conservation is anthropocentric in that strong instrumental sense. But he said something really, really beautiful, which I will actually just share with you. I'll see if I can find it now. So he reiterated this in his interview with me, but in his 2017 statement from Arusha for the UN Ocean Conference, he said this. He said, "We will continue to expand our marine program and are committed to utilizing the Sustainable Development Goals to help us reflect on how well, in particular, we are loving our neighbors, both our fellow humans and all life on our planet." And I just thought that was so profound, and seeing it more and more that that Christians are recognizing that this core ethic, biblical ethic of neighbor love, extends to non-human others. And this is borne out in the program that he developed there. So I'll just read a little bit more. He says they've given special prominence to a little nondescript species of coral, the crisp pillow coral, as it's called, which can be found in rock pools along the shore. And what Bob said to me is, this little critter isn't pretty. You would never notice it. It doesn't do anything for it. Yet, he said, it has intrinsic value as a fellow creature, beloved by God, and it has an ethical call upon us as a neighbor in need. And I just found that so profound and so inspiring, that this is not only faith as an inspiration for ecological engagement, but actually shaping the way that is done. You know, it's a different conservation agenda when you see what you are doing as responding to the cry of a neighbor in need.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful sentiment, and so simple in a way. It's just neighbor love at the end of the day. It's that, and just like that includes all the neighbors, even the ones who aren't pretty and don't do anything for us.
Exactly. It gets complicated, of course, because one's neighbors may have conflicting interests.
That's true.
So, you know, this doesn't simplify matters.
Yeah, it really opens it up so much wider.
It opens it up. That's right. Yeah.
That's great. That's so wonderful. And a beautiful note to end on, that the way faith can shape our conservation efforts. And it doesn't make it easy, but it certainly makes it inspiring and worthwhile, and so much strength that it can give us in the work that we're doing. So, geez, Kate Rigby, thank you so much for making time for us. This was really a delight. We'll have to do it again sometime, because we only scratched the surface. We have so many other things to talk about. And you have the book you edited on religion, materialism, and ecology. We could have gotten into new materialist stuff, and so much more to talk about. But generally, try to keep it around an hour just to honor people's time and including the listener. And so thank you so much for this. It was really, really a treat.
You're welcome, Sam.
And thanks for everybody for tuning in, for listening or watching. And we'll be back with some more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.